Topic of our Dhamma talk this evening is contemplating the nature of arising, or contemplating the nature of passing away, or contemplating both the nature of arising and passing away. And the subtitle of our talk this evening is some basic aspects of the Satipatthana Sutta. Now, the Satipatthana Sutta, the discourse on the establishment of mindfulness, is probably the most important discourse, most important foundation for the practice that we're doing here together. And some of you will be familiar with it, some of you might have read it maybe a few times, many times, and certainly some of you might not be familiar with it at all. Now, just like with many other discourses given by the Buddha, the Satipatthana Sutta is structured in a very systematic manner. And as Venerable Analayo has pointed out in his book, Satipatthana, there is first the introduction part, and certainly in this part, it gets stated where this discourse was given, namely in the land of the Kurus, at a town of the Kuru people, namely Kamasa Dhamma. And it so happened that the Buddha and a group of disciples were staying there. And the Buddha then addressed his monastic disciples, and then they said, "Venerable Sir," or "Yes, Venerable Sir," and then the Buddha started giving the discourse. Now, the second part of the discourse, you might refer to it as the preamble, contains the main benefits to be obtained from this practice. And among those, there are 7 in number, and those are this practice of the establishment of mindfulness will lead to the purification of the mind. It will lead to the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation. It will lead to the destruction of physical pain, dukkha, as well as mental distress, and further it would lead to the entering of the right path, until the final major benefit is the realization of nibbana. Now, a question to you. Are there only 7 benefits to the Satipatthana practice? Is that all? Have we come for this? There are 7 benefits as the most major, given as the most major benefits, but apart from those, there are so many others. And many other benefits that we will gradually discover in the course of this retreat, as well as outside of retreat. Now, this first preamble, the first preamble then is followed by what Venerable Analayo has referred to as the definition part, and this part gives you the gist of the Satipatthana instructions. And now, to give you that part, so that you've heard it at least once. Here, a retreatant dwells contemplating the body in the body, ardent, clearly comprehending and mindful, having removed covetousness and discontent for the world, or in regard to the world. One dwells contemplating feelings, in feelings, ardent, clearly comprehending and mindful, having removed covetousness and discontent in regard to the world. One dwells contemplating the mind, in the mind, ardent, clearly comprehending and mindful, having removed covetousness and discontent for the world, or in regard to the world. And then the last part is one dwells contemplating dhammas, in dhammas, again ardent, or in other words with effort, and then clearly comprehending sampajanya with mindful and having removed covetousness and discontent in regard to the world. Now, what follows then is a description of the four establishments of mindfulness. So, the contemplation of the body, kaya anupassana satipatthana, followed by the contemplation of feelings, followed by contemplation of the mind, and lastly contemplation of the dhammas. Now, the contemplation of the body then gets subdivided into various, or into very specific exercises, such as a mindful contemplation of breathing, then a mindful contemplation of postures, then of activities, clear comprehension of activities, then contemplation of the parts of the body, and then a contemplation of the elements, and finally a contemplation of a corpse in various stages of decay. Each of these sub-aspects of kaya anupassana satipatthana then are followed by what Venerable Analayu calls the refrain, namely a paragraph that is identical, that contains the same message, but adapted to the respective exercise that has been just given. So, in the case of the, let's say, contemplation of breathing, in this way, in regard to the body, one abides contemplating the body internally, or one abides contemplating the body externally, or one abides contemplating the body both internally and externally. One abides contemplating the nature of the arising in the body, or one abides contemplating the nature of passing away in the body, or one abides contemplating the nature of both arising and passing away in the body. And the title is derived from this particular passage, title of our Dhamma talk. Mindfulness that there is a body is established in the retreatant to the extent necessary for bare knowledge and continuous mindfulness. One abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. That is how, in regard to the body, one abides contemplating the body. So this refrain you can then find after each exercise in mindfulness. This then is certainly followed by a description of how to do the mindful contemplation of feelings, then of the mind, and then when it comes to a contemplation of dhammas, namely phenomena, or simply dhammas, to leave the term untranslated, this then gets further subdivided into a mindful contemplation of the hindrances, of the 5 aggregates, the 6 sense spheres, the 7 enlightenment factors, and finally the 4 noble truths. Now, having given the instructions this far, the Buddha gradually comes to a conclusion by making a prediction of what will happen to a retreatant who will follow these instructions and will meditate seriously, wholeheartedly. And so it says, a retreatant who practices these 4 establishments of mindfulness for a period of 7 years is bound to experience one out of 2 things, namely the realization of the Dhamma, so the final realization of arahantship. And if this is not possible as yet, and some desire remains, then one is guaranteed to reach at least anagamihood, namely non-return. And then the prediction continues. If one were to practice for 6 years, this will happen for 5, or 4, 3, 2, 1 years, 1 year, and then if one were to practice for 11 months and 10 months and so on, 6 months, and then all the way down to 1 week. And that prediction section is followed by another, by the preamble, namely stating the benefits to be gained by this mindfulness practice, and then finally there's the conclusion. So just to give you, I'm mentioning all of this just certainly for you to have a framework that you can then relate to, and certainly the 2 passages that have been quoted now are part of this certain framework. Now, when we take a first general look at these instructions on mindfulness meditation, then we might certainly find that a careful, mindful contemplation of various parts of a human being are being recommended. So basically, what we have here could be termed as analysis, a mindful, contemplative analysis of what is actually happening, of what we ordinarily refer to as an individual or a being. So for a retreatant to look at various aspects connected to the body, to look at this whole range of feelings, of consciousness and mental factors that rise together with consciousness, and then finally various Dhamma aspects. Now, to give you an illustration in this regard, it is nothing other then to come for the first time to the Taos ski valley, and certainly then one tries to find out what this place is all about. So, what's the nature of Taos ski valley? Is this a mining town? Or, as the name indicates, a ski resort? Or is it maybe also a summer vacation for those who don't want to ski? And then, what about the population here? What's the population figure? What's the distribution of the population? What about the resident population? What about certainly those who come here for skiing and certainly for hiking and so on and so forth? Then, what about certainly the layout of the town? Is it done in a very systematic manner? What about the architectural style of this place? What about the history of this place? And then what about the surrounding, the elevation? Can you think of anything else? There's so many things that we could endeavor to find out with regard to a place known as Taos Ski Valley. Same thing with what is known a human being. Now, we happen to be human beings, but do we really understand ourselves fully or not? Do we? Nada, what do you think? Yes? No? No, absolutely not. So, since there is much room for discovery, the Buddha has recommended those 4 establishments of mindfulness. Now, contemplating the nature of arising in the body, contemplating the nature of passing away in the body, or both. The term that certainly is very important in this context is the term contemplating. In the Pali scriptural language, the corresponding verb would be anupassati, and anupassati is related to the noun anupassana. And when we look at this term in a Pali English dictionary, the dictionary might certainly give us words such as contemplation, looking at, viewing, or repeated observation. And that term repeated observation does seem to fit quite well, especially if we look at the further explanations of anupassana offered in the text. Now, the Visuddhimagga in one passage explains it as follows, namely, anu and passati, 2 parts. Passati means he, she, it sees. Anu implies a repeated action, and furthermore in diverse ways. So, a repeated and diverse observation of some object. Observing an object from different angles, as Venerable Analayo has pointed out. Now, the Visuddhimagga then summarizes this, and it says, one sees always accordingly, anupassati, and the meaning thereof is one sees again and again in various modes. Hence, it is said one contemplates. Now, I would say in the English language, there is an identity between the two words contemplation and repeated observation. So what we do here in the meditation practice is nothing other than again and again, time and again, looking at familiar objects such as the bottom of the feet, yes. Anything else? What's that?
Tension in the head.
Oh, tension in the head. Anything else that comes up for you, Max? Rising and falling movement of the abdomen. Sure enough. And? Anyone else? Is that all? Thinking. Oh, this must be a popular one among some of you. So, from the very beginning of our mindfulness practice until the very end of it, and basically our mindfulness practice ends when we pass away, we will be observing the same set of predominant objects. However, we will see them in the course of this 1 month retreat, in the course of several years or many years, we will see those objects in many different ways. And so the objects present themselves to the observing mind in different ways. Now, since we are looking at general and fundamental aspects of the Satipatthana practice, during the first few days of a retreat, retreatants are likely to see the specific qualities of objects. So, to see in one rising movement of the abdomen, tension, tightness, stiffness, expansion. Then in the case of the falling movement of the abdomen, to see specific sensations such as a release of tension, release of stiffness, tightness, maybe a sense of relaxation, ease, contraction, and so on and so forth. So, this particular aspect of seeing the specific qualities of objects is referred to in the Pali scripture language as sabhava lakkhana. And this, however, is not going to be the prevalent mode forever. After a few days of intensive practice, retreatants, or the focus of attention, of observation, will then start falling onto a slightly different aspect. Namely, having discerned various specific objects for a while, one then starts to see certain aspects that are common to all objects, and very simple aspects, such as all objects have a middle portion. In other words, you could call it all objects have an occurrence. They are present for a while, and they might undergo changes. Now, is that all? Is that the only way we experience objects? Just being there. What else might come up? What else might we discover? Well, in line with the topic of our talk, one might discover there is an arising to an object, and then there is an arising also to a second object, and to a third object, and suddenly there are so many arisings, which means the mind then is certainly not only specializing in seeing the occurrence of an object, but it certainly then discovers also there's a beginning of an object. Now, having explored this particular aspect, and in Pali the technical term for this is Sankata Lakkhana, the characteristic of the conditioning of objects, and then we are likely to explore yet a different aspect, namely the aspect that is, or aspects that are universal to all formations. And those are very simple things, namely that formations undergo change, that those formations that keep changing are therefore unsatisfactory. We would rather have them be more permanent, and especially pleasant experiences. And certainly then, having seen the change in formations and that they are unsatisfactory, sooner or later we might realize that formations actually lack a self, or are not identical with a self. Now, in the course of our mindfulness practice, we are likely to experience formations in many different ways. These are just a few ways in order to give you some examples. So to see the nature of arising in the body, to see the nature of the passing away in the body, and then to see both of those is nothing other than to see what? Very simple, to see the impermanence of formations. Now, there are different aspects or different levels of understanding that are possible with regard to impermanence. At first, our understanding of impermanence will be somewhat superficial. So we see some changes in a rising movement, in a falling movement, and also with regard to other objects. Later on, this understanding will become much deeper. Now, if one experiences a wonderful mental state of happiness or contentment, and it's really far out, and one really wants to hold on and experience it some more, however, impermanence does what it's supposed to do, namely brings about a change, and that happiness, that profound contentment goes, then this might not be, or this certainly might be a bit disappointing. Now, when we gradually realize that we're growing older, which is just another aspect of impermanence, this too might not be all that wonderful, and might be somewhat disappointing. Now, we all tend to have a sense of self. Me, so-and-so. There's a name to it, there's a autobiography that goes along with it. Now, if in the course of deep meditation we see, and that self is taken to be, to have much substance and to be permanent, and we then see how that self at times falls apart or is not even present, then what about the mental reaction? Will we be joyous and up and dancing? Probably not. So, contemplating the nature of arising in the body and the nature of passing away in the body, and both, is a way of understanding impermanence in a comprehensive manner, and also over time developing equanimity towards this particular aspect. Now, equanimity will not be there right away. This is something that we have to work for, and that will gradually then arise. So, one of the benefits of contemplating this arising power, the nature of the arising passing of formations, is a better understanding of impermanence, and then dealing with it in an equanimous way. There's yet another benefit that could be ascribed to this particular fundamental way of contemplating. Namely, if one keeps seeing that bodily as well as mental formations keep changing, may then bring a new view with regard to those bodily and mental formations. So we realize they are rather, they're impermanent rather than being permanent. So formations are seen as somewhat fleeting. Now, it does not end there. When our practice has gone pretty deep, we might realize that the observing and knowing mind is what? Permanent or impermanent? Impermanent. So what you have then is something that is impermanent itself, namely the observing and knowing mind, is observing objects that are equally impermanent and continuously changing. So this then makes for a huge number of possible connections or possible conditions. So if one sees that both the object observed as well as the observing and knowing mind are fundamentally impermanent, then this might change our view of ourselves. So as long as we're holding on to a notion of a self, usually a sense of permanence goes along with it. And for the most part, people think that suddenly this observing and knowing part of us is pretty permanent, is pretty solid. We can rely on this. And now we find out this is not the case. So what happens is the substantiality, as Venerable Analayo is pointing out, that then vanishes. The contemplation of the nature of the arising of formations in the body and the nature of the passing away in the body has the potential, if developed sufficiently, to lead a retreat into the realization of the first path of enlightenment, to the second, to the third, and even to the fourth level of enlightenment. So all the way to the final goal.
Would you say that again, that last sentence?
Oh, I'm saying that this certain contemplation of impermanence can lead, or has the potential to lead a retreatant, at least to the realization of the first path of enlightenment, namely stream entry, as well as to the second, the third, and the fourth level of enlightenment. So, in other words, this form of contemplation carries the highest potential. Now, having seen time and again that formations are not permanent, one can no longer believe in permanence. Permanence then is certainly just a concept and certainly not very meaningful. Now, in the gist of the meditation instructions as certainly given in the definition part of the Satipatthana Sutta, it says, and this is very typical or a very distinctive feature, it says to contemplate the body in the body, feelings in feelings, and then the mind in the mind, and dhammas in dhammas. So there's a certain meaning that the Buddha tried to bring across with this a bit unusual way of expressing things. Now, usually oftentimes when we contemplate a bodily formation, let's say some pain, some intense pain, then we might get certainly carried away by memories of a similar experience, the contemplation of a different pain, maybe 3 years ago in a different retreat. Now, that is not certainly what the Buddha had in mind, but rather when a bodily formation is predominant, that we give full focus onto that bodily formation, at least for the time being that we observe that bodily formation, that pain, that we concentrate on that, and to the exclusion of memories and certain other unrelated things. If at some other point in our practice, and could be anything in the same sitting, the most predominant object happens to be a feeling, so a pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feeling, then we will want to give full attention to that particular feeling, at the exclusion of other new things, at the exclusion of mixing in thoughts, or mixing in certain mental states, or mixing in some bodily formation. Now, when the mind, so consciousness in association with a particular mental state is predominant, and in the text, when one knows that the mind arises together or in association with greed, then one knows just that, and one observes just that, and not mixed in with other things. The same thing goes for the contemplation of, let's say, a certain Dhamma aspect. So when the hindrances, one or all of the hindrances are predominant, then one's attention is fully on those certain hindrances, to the exclusion of other things. So to the exclusion of feelings, to the exclusion of bodily formations. So it's one thing at a time. Now, it's worth highlighting this point, because as retreatants we do not necessarily practice that certain way. And our observation tends to, as Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi has observed, tends to be cluttered by various other aspects. And so the mind, the observation needs to be purified of unwanted proliferations. So we want just when a bodily formation is predominant, we want to observe just that bare bodily formation. The same thing would go for feeling and so on and so forth. Now, in the definition part of the Satipatthana Sutta, it says, one dwells contemplating the body in the body, ardent, clearly comprehending, mindful, and having removed covetousness and discontent in regard to the body. Or another, in the Pali for this is Vinaya Loka Abhijja Domanasam. And in other words, we try to observe an object free from desires and discontent. Now, much could be said about this particular instruction here, but I will try to keep it as simple as possible. Contemplating the body, feelings, the mind, and dhammas does not mean that first off, prior to intensive practice, prior to these different contemplations, that the mind has to be totally purified of covetousness and of discontent. But rather, when we actually do observe predominant objects, that we do so without that mental reactivity, without those desires and discontent in regard to the world, in regard to the formations that come up in the body and in the mind, or in the aggregates. Now, an untrained mind has the tendency to go from one extreme to the other, namely from liking to disliking, from disliking back to liking, and so on. When we come across a desirable object, the mind will like it. When we come across some undesirable object, disliking will be there. And this may happen thousands of times. And it's rather exhausting. And it's a rather unskillful, useless pattern of the mind. So, even though we may not have attained complete freedom from covetousness and then or sense desire and discontent in regard to the world, yet we can make an attempt at observing objects relatively with a mind that is relatively and temporarily free from desires and discontent. And if at times when we observe an object and we realize there is some desire there is some disliking there, some discontent there, then we might take that very desire and that very discontent itself as an object of observation, and certainly then in applying mindfulness to those certain states, they might at least temporarily subside. So ideally, we want to observe objects with a mind that is non-reactive, that accepts objects as they come, whether we like them or not, without any preferences, without ignoring unpleasant formations and preferring pleasant formations. Now, another fundamental aspect that comes up in the refrain, the so-called refrain of the Satipatthana Sutta, is that of observing objects without identifying with them. So without certain identification. Now what does this mean? Let's say happiness comes up and immediately the mind identifies with it, and certainly then maybe thinks or relates to the happiness as my happiness. That's me. That certain happiness is part of me that determines my personality or my being, whatever. Or when at other times, let's say, sadness has arisen in the mind, and the sadness becomes quite predominant, quite strong, even quite intense, and then an identification with it might take place, and we take it to be my sadness. I'm so sad. I'm totally overwhelmed by the sadness. Now, identification is the opposite of disidentification. Now, disidentification means that when happiness has arisen in the stream of consciousness, it's just another object of observation. That's all. We just focus our attention onto it. We observe it in an objective manner. We know its nature. We know the nature of its arising, of its passing away, and that's it. In the case of the sadness, it's the same thing. We don't relate to it as my sadness, but rather as just another object, just another mental state, and we observe it in a rather detached manner, objective manner. Now, it is so easy for a teacher to talk about identification, but for a retreatant not to get identified in the actual practice with certain bodily states or the mental states, that part is difficult. At times can be very difficult. Now, the way the instructions, and quite a number of the instructions have been phrased in the Satipatthana Sutta, as well as other relevant discourses, allows to conclude that the Buddha did encourage labeling. And this can be derived from the Pali word iti at the end of a quote. Now, when we start labeling objects, then this labeling will bring about a certain, or will break up the identification with an object to some extent. And so one sits there and experiences this far out contentment, happiness. One feels like being on top of the world, and is totally indulging in it. And one then remembers the instruction to label the predominant experience. So one does this, and one labels as contentment, as happiness, as well-being, as certain feeling like being on top of the world. That immediately brings about a certain disidentification. It brings about a certain distance between what is happening and then the observing and knowing mind. Now, the labeling will help in different ways. It will help to strengthen our clear recognition of what it is that we are experiencing, as well as strengthen our understanding of the object. And as mentioned, it brings about a certain inner detachment and diminishes identification, especially with moods and emotions. Now, on occasion, retreatants find the labeling to be somewhat awkward and getting in their way of observation of what is happening, and then may not want to continue with it, and they might say and that's the labeling, this verbalizing, what happens in one's practice in verbalizing in the mind, as somewhat as an obstruction, as a difficulty. Now, the mind tends to be extremely flexible, and in experience shows that labeling, or in other words, verbalizing, commenting to oneself what one is experiencing right now. So now, rising movement, and then the falling movement, and suddenly then a pain, and suddenly this, and suddenly that. This form of verbalizing to oneself what one is experiencing does not really conflict with mindfulness practice. So the mind can actually do it. And you can ask any advanced retreatant whether labeling is still possible or not, and the person will say yes. Now, there are certain points in the practice when things become very, very refined, and one that might then want to temporarily discontinue the labeling. This, yes, sure. But overall, generally stating, the labeling is possible for the mind. The mind can do it. Now, from an experiential point of view, one can say that the labeling also very much helps to keep the thinking at bay. So if one finds that for a while the mind is overwhelmed by thinking, one doesn't know what to do about it, how to contain it, then to pick up one's labeling, to be really firm about it, it would be a very good way of then decreasing the thinking. Actually, scientific research exists that is saying that labeling, verbally expressing one's emotions, is an important way to let go of some of those emotionally charged thoughts or mental states. Now, one abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. For us as retreatants, this means however exciting or however devastating an experience might be that comes up, we remain independent and not clinging to anything in the world. Neither clinging to desirable experiences, nor clinging, and at times the mind does this, nor clinging to even undesirable experiences. When at times, let's say, our sense of self is very much at stake, and the self loses its substantiality, at such a point, for consciousness to hold on to even some unpleasant, undesirable object, this is quite normal. And so, when this happens, not to identify with any formation. Now, towards the beginning of the retreat, the illustration of a visitor was given who comes to for the first time to Taos Ski Valley, and Satya then takes a look around, wants to find out about Taos, and does an analysis of Taos ski valley, and looks at different Satya aspects that would characterize Satya, this Satya smaller town. Likewise, when we engage in the contemplation of the body, there's so many different aspects to pay attention to. So the body cannot be fully understood by simply just looking at the breathing. This is an important aspect, yes, but there are other aspects. Now, as human beings, we tend to assume a posture. We're always assuming one posture or another. At nighttime, we'll assume the sleeping posture, the lying posture. And certainly then, when we line up for food, we assume the standing posture. There you go. And not the sitting posture. And certainly then, when it's time for walking meditation, we assume the walking posture. And when it's time for sitting meditation, we assume the sitting posture. Now, much could be said, but time, we're already far beyond 8 o'clock. So we have these time constraints. So much could be said about the posture itself, but let me limit it to just a few essential aspects. The posture that we're assuming, let's say in sitting, whether we sit perfectly upright or in a slouched manner, in a slumped manner, leaning to this side or that side, or the body is maybe swinging or swaying, and whether our posture is stiff or rather relaxed, and then comfortable or not comfortable. There are so many things that could certainly be observed and investigated in the course of our mindful contemplation of the body. You might certainly on occasion want to pay attention to the connection between the predominant mental state and your posture. So let's say when the mind is totally overwhelmed by anger, then what's your posture like? And when first anger is there, and this turns suddenly into restlessness or is accompanied by restlessness, then again, how does that influence your posture? So there are many things that could be investigated. When you feel afraid, what's your posture like? When courage is present, what's your posture like? Now, more could be said on the mindful contemplation of the body. One could certainly speak about certainly the dhatu vavadhana, namely an analysis of a being into different elements, into the four great elements, or the 6 elements, including consciousness and satna space. But we are running out of time, and so that might be mentioned at some other point. Now, allow me to conclude by wishing, may this vavadhana that we are engaged in, namely a careful investigation, a careful analysis into what is actually going on, what certainly we commonly refer to as a human being or as an individual, may that analysis result in the arising of profound insights, of a profound of right views, right perceptions, and ultimately may it lead to the realization of at least the first path of enlightenment, namely the path of stream entry. And may this happen hopefully during this very retreat here in the Taos Ski Valley. And this is it for tonight.